Hi, so we're still looking at social behaviour and in particular altruism and kin selection. Okay, so altruism. Altruism is a term where the donor is harmed by giving to the recipient. So for example, if you give food to another animal, then you don't have the food anymore. We tend to use different terms for that. We often talk about people being selfless. And this is just basically the key term you need to know. In social groups, what you often see is something called reciprocal altruism. So the individual will give, but in the expectation that you get return from the recipient. It's a favour system, basically. But what that means is you need memory, so this is quite a complex system, and you need to be able to trust. Very common example given for that is in vampire bats. So vampire bats can only go without food for 2 nights. If they're unsuccessful, then it will beg for food from a successful bat, which can regurgitate some of the blood, and that can be licked up. Okay, but the successful bats will only do this for bats that have helped them out before. Now, obviously that means at some point a bat has to trust, but they will remember who's helped them out. This is a very famous thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. So the idea is that if you have 2 suspects that are charged with a crime, they are definitely guilty, but there's not enough evidence. Okay, so they're interviewed separately. These are the options they're given. Okay, first option is if you testify and your accomplice stays silent, you will go free, they'll get 8 years. Okay, second option is you testify. If they testify, you're both going to get 4 years. And your third option is both of you say nothing, you're both going to get 1 year. And that's the evidence that they actually have. Okay, so this can be plotted out in terms of the idea of social behaviour and game theory. Okay, game theory of this is a matrix that you set up for kind of benefits and penalties. Okay, so if suspect 1 in red and suspect 2 in blue here, okay, so if suspect 1 confesses and suspect 2 also confesses, they both end up with 4 years. Okay, if suspect 1 doesn't confess, they'll end up with 8 years, even though, and suspect 2 will get nothing. Okay. If suspect 1 confesses and suspect 2 doesn't, suspect 1 gets no years, suspect 2 gets 8. And if they both don't confess, then they end up with 1 each. So the game theory goes, if the suspect goes for the best personal outcome, which is to get nothing, no time served, they end up with the worst possible mutual outcome, because what you've had is, if we go up for 1 confessing and 1, so if this, say suspect 1 confesses, they get no years in jail, okay, but in total there's going to be 8 served here, so it's the worst possible mutual outcome. Okay, if they trust each other, then they get the best possible mutual outcome, even though there is personal not good for both. And this is a really important kind of idea, that you can see how trust is really important for how likely you are to benefit and not. I don't think that we should be taking this in terms of you should go and do a crime. So in altruistic behaviour, quite often you see this happening, but it's actually not about just what you're doing, it's who you're doing it for. So if it's a related individual that is being helped, then this also increases the survival chances of your shared genetic inheritance. This is called kin selection. So it is altruistic in some ways. It is also arguing that it's actually about the common genetics. So you could have groups of closely related animals that will all look after each other because they're closely related. An interesting aside on this would be to look at what's called the coefficients of relatedness. So what that means is that if you take something like a parent to offspring, there is a 0.5, 50% basically we're seeing here, so a 0.5 coefficient of shared relationship, because obviously a parent has to give 50% of its DNA to its offspring. Siblings, so full siblings with the same parents, will also have a coefficient of 0.5. Because you had half from one parent, half from another, statistically you're going to end up with a half of the same genetics. Half siblings, 0.25. Aunts, uncles, you can see how as you move further away you get a lowered coefficient. And Hamilton's rule put all of these into equations to show how genes would increase in frequency using kin selection. So if you support relationships which are closer in terms of their coefficient and support, say, siblings, then that means that you are more likely to have your shared genetics passed on. So social insects show a division of labour within their large group, and these are really quite interesting how they set these up. Only a small number have a reproductive function, and then there's a vast number which are sterile and therefore cannot directly pass on their DNA. So for them, those sterile individuals, the reason that they work the way they work is to actually give the potential for passing on their shared genetic heritage. So this extreme altruism by the workers is actually kin selection for their DNA. This is just an interesting book because I'm all about you reading more. So in bees, a very specific type of social insect, we have a single queen. All of the insects are produced from the queen, and they are fertilized by a small number of drones. And then the workers are all females, and they have a 0.5 relatedness coefficient to the queen, so therefore they have a real reason to work together to make the colony survive. Another very interesting book. The last concept I want to look at in this particular set of slides is the keystone species. So a keystone is a point at the top of an arc, this one here. Okay, once you have that keystone in, then the arc is completely stable. If you take that out, the whole thing collapses. Okay, that keystone is essential to actually keeping the structure. And so that idea has been brought into the idea of a species in an ecosystem. So in an ecosystem, what you might have is one species that you maybe don't even know is a keystone until it's removed. Social insects are very often keystone species. Without them, the entire thing doesn't work. And within the keystone species, there are lots of things that they do. So it may be that they are regulating other animal populations, so keeping particularly competitive species in check so that they don't completely take over. They may be pollination, which is absolutely essential. They might be getting rid of waste, recycling, again, insects, really, really important here. They may be enhancing habitats, and you've got here a picture of the elephant, which we now understand actually does an awful lot of engineering by ripping down trees before they take over sections of the grassland, so they actually maintain the grassland areas. And ones that you may have seen more commonly as an example of an engineer, we've got beavers building dams which change the flows of rivers, and etc, etc. Okay, that's us for this one.